It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. 005. That was Henry Kissinger's brutal assessment of U.S. foreign policy, and today Ukraine is finding that out the hard way. This is why Trump is in a rush to settle some sort of deal with Putin, a deal where Ukraine would surrender territory, resources, and sovereignty to Russia. In return, Trump hopes Putin will ally with him against a much bigger, more powerful adversary in the Far East. As calculated as it may seem, Trump's divide-and-conquer policy toward Russia and China stems from a flawed misreading of the past and a misunderstanding of the present. Kissinger's trilateral policy succeeded for two reasons. Firstly, by the time of his secret trip to China in 1971, Moscow and Beijing had already been bitter enemies for years, and China sought to improve relations with America as a counterweight to Soviet power. Secondly, at the time, Moscow wanted to patch up ties with Washington to reduce the pressure of both the arms race with America and its standoff with China. Fast forward to today, and the dynamics have changed. Neither of those past conditions exists now. Russia and China aren't ideological soulmates, but they are strategic partners. They share a mutual disdain for American hegemony and have found a way to work together based on shared interests, and that's good enough. For added context, China steadily became Russia's largest economic partner following the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Western sanctions that followed. The Ukraine war then cemented this relationship. As the United States and the European Union applied even harsher sanctions, Russia came to rely almost entirely on China. Trade between the two soared. In the last 2 years, for instance, Russia got about 40% of its imports from China and sent over 30% of its exports there. Military cooperation has also ramped up, with joint exercises and intelligence sharing mechanisms now firmly in place. The two complement one another's strategic shortcomings. Russia is an abundant source of natural resources and has provided China with cheap energy and technology transfers. Meanwhile, China is an industrial powerhouse and has offered enough economic backing to keep Russia afloat in its war against Ukraine. By combining their assets, Moscow and Beijing could well dominate Eurasia, which is precisely what America fears the most. Admittedly, Russia doesn't like playing second fiddle to Beijing, but it recognizes the economic lifeline that China provides, especially since it has been cut off from many global financial markets. What's more, as Beijing's power and influence continue to grow, Russia sees this as an opportunity to leverage its alliance to maintain geopolitical influence in a multipolar world. So Russia's pivot toward China is not just a reaction to U.S. policy, it's part of a broader realignment in the global order. Today, the partnership with China has become a strategic imperative for Russia, and its modern-day leaders see no alternative to it. Trump's objective to flip Russia isn't just theory, it's been floated before. During his first tenure, Kissinger reportedly encouraged Trump to improve relations with Moscow to counterbalance China's rise. But here's where reality sets in. The Ukraine war has made any American-Russian reset nearly impossible. The West has levied heavy sanctions on Moscow, and the Europeans see Russia as an existential danger. So if Trump wants to split Russia and China, he has to make Putin an offer that outweighs what she provides. And right now, that's a tall order. Beijing offers economic support, diplomatic backing, and a growing tech sector that Russia desperately needs. This is not to say that the United States has nothing to offer, though. On the contrary, Trump's team is reportedly negotiating the withdrawal of American troops from NATO countries that joined after 1990, including Poland, Romania, the Baltics, and others. From the Russian point of view, NATO's eastward expansion at its doorstep is a threat to its survival, and the Kremlin would like nothing more than the exit of American troops. As of 2022, the United States has over 100,000 troops in Europe, with 10,500 troops stationed in Poland, 4,000 in Lithuania, 1,700 in Latvia, 2,200 in Estonia, 2,100 in Slovakia, 800 in Hungary, 3,300 in Romania, and 900 in Bulgaria. If Trump presses on with the withdrawal of U.S. troops, it should be taken as an attempt to court Russia with the goal of containing China. However, relations between Washington and Moscow are at their lowest. Rolling back NATO's eastern flank may not be enough. This then explains the recent shutdown of U.S. aid. You see, since the end of the Cold War, promoting democracy through U.S. aid has been a staple of American foreign policy. Institutions and organizations backed by U.S. aid have frequently and publicly criticized Russia and China for their lack of democracy. But the two have always resented this rhetoric as a violation of their sovereignty. So by closing U.S. aid, Trump is looking to make another concession to Russia. No more democracy promotion from now on, which means reducing U.S. soft power in certain parts of the world. These two major concessions, degrading NATO's eastern flank and the shutdown of U.S. aid, are in addition to Trump's sacrifice of Ukrainian territory, resources, and sovereignty. So what Trump is essentially negotiating is to redesign the global order. He's making room for the Russians, so that they join the Americans to box in China. This framework is critical to understand. Otherwise, none of what Trump does will ever make sense. Even so, it's questionable whether the Russians will take the bait. Unlike the Cold War era, when ideological rifts created political divisions, today's world is shaped by economic interdependence. Sure, Russia will gladly accept concessions from the United States, but there is little reason to believe that the Russians would reciprocate in a meaningful way, let alone do a 180-degree turn and suddenly become hostile towards Beijing. China has proven itself to be an irreplaceable ally. Another point to consider is that even with Trump's back-to-back concessions, Putin knows that this will be Trump's final term. By contrast, Putin plans to stay in power well beyond 2029, but by then a new U.S. president could take over and cancel the deal with him. For the Kremlin, this makes any agreement with Trump feeble at best. Meanwhile, relations with China are stable, predictable, and too valuable to replace. Framed this way, Trump's peace deal with Russia seems short-sighted and unlikely to work as he hopes. In fact, Trump is more likely to hurt American interests in the process. Concessions to Russia would come at the cost of alienating NATO allies, many of whom see Russia as a long-term threat. If the talks with Putin fail, Trump will have lost more than he started with. His rhetoric will damage American soft power across the board and leave Ukrainians and NATO allies feeling betrayed. The toll for this gamble will be severe, so much so that the next president will have difficulty repairing those burnt bridges. In geopolitics, as in life, the worst sin is to destroy and betray yourself for nothing. That was Henry Kissinger's brutal assessment of U.S. foreign policy, and today Ukraine is finding that out the hard way. Trump's U-turn on Ukraine has raised eyebrows in Europe and even in America itself. Once a vocal supporter of sending military aid to Kyiv, he now seems eager to broker a deal with Moscow, one that would leave Ukraine in the lurch. Behind closed doors, Trump's team has allegedly offered the Russians substantial concessions, including Ukrainian territory, sanctions relief, rolling back U.S. troops from Eastern Europe and barring Ukraine from NATO membership. And while the negotiations are still ongoing, Russia has offered little in return. This sudden pivot begs the question, why is Trump giving up so much? What does he see in a deal with Putin that makes it worth abandoning? Ukraine, a country that once received unwavering bipartisan support. Is it a genuine strategic shift or just reckless deal-making? Well, to understand Trump's goals, we have to look at the bigger picture. The one thing you never want to happen is you never want Russia and China uniting. Well, I'm gonna have to unite them, and I think I can do that too. That's Trump forecasting his approach in an interview from October 2024. The war in Ukraine has dragged on longer than many anticipated. It has taken a toll on U.S. resources, and focused Trump and his security advisors see a need to shift priorities, believing that Washington should focus on containing China rather than engaging in endless conflicts in Eastern Europe. In many ways, Trump's policy toward Russia mirrors an old Cold War strategy designed by none other than Kissinger himself. The logic behind it is simple. If two of your enemies are close, pull one away. It worked in the 1970s when the U.S. courted China to isolate the Soviet Union. Now Trump looks to pull the same trick in reverse. Flip Russia to contain China in the decades to come. Seen in this light, Ukraine has now become a pawn set to be sacrificed on the grand chessboard. That's how it goes in geopolitics. Some alliances last only until a better deal comes along. Of course, Russia and China know perfectly well what Trump is trying to do. In anticipation, Beijing is now on a charm offensive of its own. It wants to strengthen coordination with Russia. It is hosting nuclear talks and holding joint naval drills while promoting Russian goods at home. Meanwhile, more Russian oil was imported into China than ever before, and trade between the two hit a new record high. But a lot of these events are also somewhat artificial. Take the story of China and Russia strengthening coordination in international affairs. It seems reasonably objective at first. But when you look at the ownership of the sources, 54% comes from government sources. So yeah, a lot of things are all happening at the same time. Details about Trump's peace plan for Ukraine are scarce. Both American and Russian diplomats have revealed little about the extent and reach of the negotiations. All we know with certainty is that the talks are taking place during the most dangerous phase of the Ukraine war. This requires some clarification. In November 2024, the Biden administration permitted Kyiv to use long-range missiles against targets inside internationally recognized Russian territory, including US-made Attack-EMS and UK-made Storm Shadow missiles. Ukraine has put these weapons to use, hitting targets in Bryansk and Kursk. These attacks have the Kremlin on edge, not because of the damage they inflict, but because of America's disregard for Moscow's nuclear deterrent, something which the Russians have communicated many times over. Putin, for instance, has said that Ukrainian forces cannot use weapons like ATACMS and Storm Shadow without technical assistance from NATO personnel. And so, from the Russian viewpoint, when Ukraine uses these weapons, it's as if NATO itself attacking Russia. While Attack-EMS have been used against targets in Crimea, without much retaliation, hitting targets within Russia's mainland borders is a step up the escalation ladder. So, in response to what it sees as NATO aggression, the Kremlin published a new nuclear doctrine in November 2024, one that lowers the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. This new policy makes it easier for the Russians to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear countries like Ukraine. As a show of force, Russia then fired a nuclear-capable missile at a military base in Dnipro. The damage was relatively minor, so the missile probably had no payload and instead served as a demonstration of Russia's resolve. Still later in February 2025, the Russians used a drone with a high-explosive warhead to hit the former Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine, which damaged its radiation shield, though there were no signs of radiation leaks. Regardless, these incidents show the growing nuclear risks and the necessity of negotiating a ceasefire.